Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Knight d2 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to f4. Knight b6 to c4. Queen d1 to c1. Knight c4 to b6. Knight f3 to g5. Knight c6 to b4. Bishop d3 takes h7, check. King g8 to h8. Knight e2 to c3. Bishop e7 takes g5. Bishop f4 takes g5. Queen d8 to c7. Knight c3 to e4. Queen c7 takes c1. Rook a1 takes c1. King h8 takes h7. Bishop g5 to e7. Rook f8 to e8. Knight e4 to g5, check. King h7 to g6. Rook c1 takes c8. Rook a8 takes c8. Bishop e7 takes b4. King g6 takes g5. Bishop b4 to d2, check. King g5 to g6. Rook f1 to c1. King g6 to h7. Rook c1 takes c8. Rook e8 takes c8. Pawn f2 to f3. Rook c8 to c2. Bishop d2 to c3. Knight b6 to c4. Pawn b2 to b3. Rook c2 to c1, check. King g1 to f2. Rook c1 to c2, check. King f2 to g3. Knight c4 takes e5. King g3 to f4. Knight e5 to d3, check. King f4 to e3. Rook c2 takes c3. King e3 to d2. Knight d3 to f4. King d2 takes c3. Knight f4 takes g2. Pawn a2 to a3. King h7 to g6. Pawn h2 to h3. King g6 to f5. King c3 to d3. Knight g2 to f4, check. King d3 to c3. Knight f4 takes h3. King c3 to d3. Pawn e6 to e5. King d3 to c3. Knight h3 to g1. Pawn d4 takes e5. Knight g1 takes f3. King c3 to d3. Pawn g7 to g5. King d3 to c3. Pawn g5 to g4. King c3 to d3. Pawn g4 to g3. King d3 to e3. Pawn g3 to g2. Pawn e5 to e6. Pawn f7 takes e6. King e3 takes f3. Pawn g2 to g1, promoting to queen. Pawn b3 to b4. Queen g1 to a1. Pawn b4 to b5. Pawn e6 to e5. Pawn b5 to b6. Queen a1 takes a3, check. King f3 to e2. Queen a3 to b2, check. King e2 to d3. Queen b2 to b3, check. King d3 to d2. Pawn a7 to a5. King d2 to e2. Pawn a5 to a4. King e2 to d2. Pawn a4 to a3. King d2 to c1. Pawn a3 to a2. King c1 to d2. Queen b3 takes b6. King d2 to c3. Queen b6 to d4, check. King c3 to b3. Queen d4 to d2. King b3 to a3. Pawn b7 to b5. King a3 to b3. Pawn b5 to b4. King b3 to a4. Queen d2 to b2. King a4 to b5. Pawn b4 to b3. King b5 to b4. Pawn a2 to a1, promoting to queen. King b4 to c5. Queen a1 to a5, check. King c5 to c6. Queen b2 to a3. King c6 to b7. Pawn b3 to b2. King b7 to c6. Queen a3 to c5, check. King c6 to b7. Pawn b2 to b1, promoting to queen, checkmate.